The tropical dawn of May 1st, 1898, painted Manila Bay in hues of crimson and gold, but Commodore George Dewey had no time for such beauty. Standing on the bridge of his flagship USS Olympia, he peered through the morning mist at the Spanish fleet anchored in the shallow waters near Cavite. Behind him, the American Asiatic Squadron moved in perfect formation. 6 warships carrying the hopes of a nation newly awakened to its imperial destiny. The irony was not lost on Dewey. Here he was, thousands of miles from home, about to engage an enemy fleet in waters that most Americans couldn't locate on a map. The Spanish-American War had erupted just weeks earlier, triggered by the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. While his countrymen focused on Cuba, Dewey had received secret orders from Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt to prepare for operations in the Philippines. Roosevelt's prescient telegram had arrived on February 25th. Keep full of coal. In the event of declaration of war, Spain, your duty will be to see that the Spanish squadron does not leave the Asiatic station. Now, as the morning sun climbed higher, that duty was about to be fulfilled in the most decisive way possible. The Spanish squadron, commanded by Admiral Patricio Montoya y Pasaron, consisted of 7 vessels anchored in a defensive line. The flagship Reina Cristina, though outdated, still mounted respectable armament, while the other ships, Castelia, Dan Antonio de Ulloa, Don Juan de Austria, Isla de Luzon, Isla de Cuba, and Marques del Duero formed a formidable-looking barrier, but Dewey knew appearances could deceive. Intelligence reports suggested the Spanish ships were poorly maintained, undermanned, and equipped with obsolete ammunition. Some vessels were so decrepit they could barely maintain steam pressure. The Castilla, he had learned, was actually a hulk with wooden sides, a floating target rather than a fighting ship. The Commodore's own squadron told a different story. The Olympia, his flagship, was a modern protected cruiser armed with 4 8-inch guns and capable of 21 knots. The Baltimore, Boston, Raleigh, Concord, and Petrel rounded out his force, each vessel representing the cutting edge of American naval technology. His crews were well-trained professionals, many veterans of years of peacetime drills that had honed their skills to razor sharpness. According to contemporary accounts in the New York Herald, Dewey had spent months preparing his squadron for this moment, conducting extensive gunnery practice and studying Spanish naval capabilities. As the American ships closed the distance, Dewey could see the Spanish crews scrambling to their battle stations. The sight stirred something within him, not pity, but the cold calculation of a professional warrior. He had served with distinction in the Civil War, learning the hard lessons of naval combat under fire. He understood that in battle, hesitation was death, and overwhelming force was mercy. "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley," he would soon tell his flag captain, Charles Gridley. But first, there was the approach, careful, methodical advance that would position his ships for maximum effect. The morning breeze carried the acrid smell of coal smoke from his own funnels. Mixing with the tropical scents of the distant shore, history was about to turn on the next few hours, though neither Dewey nor his Spanish opponents fully grasped the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The battle would not merely decide the fate of the Philippines, it would announce America's arrival as a global naval power at 5:39 in the morning. The USS Olympia's forward 8-inch gun spoke with a voice of thunder that shattered the tropical stillness. The shells screamed across the bay, marking the beginning of what would become one of the most lopsided naval engagements in modern history. Commodore Dewey, standing calmly on his bridge, watched as the projectile fell short of the Spanish line, sending up a towering column of water that caught the morning light like liquid crystal. "The range is 5,000 yards, called out Lieutenant Carlos Calkins, the ship's navigator. Dewey nodded almost imperceptibly. The opening shot had been deliberate, not meant to hit, but to gauge the distance and announce American intentions with unmistakable clarity. Admiral Montoya, aboard the Spanish flagship Reina Cristina, responded immediately. The Spanish guns erupted in a ragged volley, their muzzle flashes creating brief orange blooms against the green backdrop of Cavite. The shells whistled overhead, most falling harmlessly into the bay, though several struck uncomfortably close. To the American line, difference in accuracy was already becoming apparent. Captain Charles Gridley of the Olympia turned to his Commodore with barely contained excitement. "Shall we close the range, sir?" The question hung in the air as Spanish shells continued to splash around the American squadron, their crews working their guns with desperate efficiency. Dewey's response would echo through naval history. "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley." His voice carried no emotion. No excitement, only the cold professionalism of a man who had calculated the odds and found them acceptable. The order rippled through the ship's speaking tubes, reaching every gun crew simultaneously. What followed was a demonstration of American naval gunnery that would be studied in academies for decades to come. As the Olympia's main battery opened, with methodical precision, each gun crew working with the smooth rhythm of a well-oiled machine, the 8 tinch shells, each weighing 250 pounds, began falling among the Spanish ships with devastating accuracy. The Baltimore, following in line, added her voice to the chorus. Her 10-inch guns, the heaviest weapons in Dewey's squadron, sent massive projectiles arcing through the morning air. Captain Nehemiah Deere had trained his crews relentlessly during the long Pacific crossing, and their skill now showed in every perfectly timed salvo. Contemporary reports from war correspondents aboard the revenue cutter McCulloch described the American gunnery as magnificent in its precision and terrible in its effect. The Spanish ships, anchored in shallow water to prevent them from sinking completely when hit, found themselves unable to maneuver effectively. The Reina Cristina, Montoyo's flagship, took the brunt of the American fire after shell crashed into her superstructure, starting fires that spread with alarming speed. Her 8-inch guns replied gamely, but the Spanish ammunition was proving defective, many shells failing to explode even when they found their targets. Aboard the Don Antonio de Ulloa, Captain Luis Cadarso watched his ship being systematically destroyed around him. The vessel's thin armor provided no protection against the heavy American shells, which punched through her sides with contemptuous ease. His crew, many of them colonial militia with minimal training, worked their guns with desperate courage, knowing they faced impossible odds. The Castilla, that ancient hulk disguised as a warship, quickly became a floating inferno. Her wooden sides, weakened by years of tropical rot, offered no resistance to the American projectiles. Flames licked up her masts, and her crew began the grim work of preparing to abandon ship. As the battle entered its second hour, the disparity in firepower and training became overwhelmingly apparent. The American ships moved in perfect formation, their guns firing in controlled salvos that walked their shots onto target with scientific precision. The Spanish fleet, brave but outclassed, found their return fire increasingly ineffective as casualties mounted and damage accumulated. Dewey, observing the carnage through his binoculars, felt no satisfaction, only the grim certainty that the morning's work was proceeding exactly as he had planned. The Spanish hopes in Manila Bay were drowning under a deluge of American steel. By 7 o'clock, the Spanish squadron was dying in agony. The Reina Cristina, Admiral Montoyo's flagship, had become a floating charnel house. Her superstructure was a twisted mass of metal, her decks slippery with blood, and fires raged from bow to stern. Yet still her guns spoke, crewed by men who knew they were fighting for honor rather than victory. Captain Luis Cadarso of the Don Antonio de Ulloa embodied the Spanish spirit that morning. Though his ship was holed below the waterline and listing heavily to starboard, he refused to strike his colors. Standing on his bridge, uniform singed and face blackened by smoke, he continued to direct his guns even as American shells systematically destroyed his vessel around him. His attention guns had been silenced one by one, but his secondary battery still replied to the American fire with defiant salvos. The courage of individual Spanish sailors shone through the carnage. On the Isla de Luzon in San Jose Maria, Duran took command when his captain fell wounded, rallying his men to keep fighting despite the ship's desperate condition. The vessel's single 6-inch gun continued firing until a direct hit from the USS Boston's 8-inch battery finally silenced it forever. Aboard the USS Olympia, Commodore Dewey watched the destruction with professional detachment. His ships had been firing for over an hour, and ammunition was beginning to run low on some vessels. More concerning reports were reaching him of potential problems with his own ammunition supply. At 7:35, he made a decision that would become part of naval legend. Captain Gridley, he called to his flag captain, "Order the squadron to withdraw from action. We'll breakfast and count our ammunition." The order seemed almost casual, as if he were calling a halt to morning drill rather than one of history's most decisive naval battles. According to the detailed account published in Harper's Weekly following the battle, this intermission demonstrated Dewey's complete confidence in the outcome and his concern for proper naval procedures. Even in the heat of combat, the American ships withdrew to the center of the bay, their crews securing guns and assessing damage. Remarkably, not a single American sailor had been killed, and only a handful were wounded, mostly from splinters and flying debris. The USS Baltimore had taken a single shell hit that caused minimal damage. The Spanish marksmanship, hampered by defective ammunition and obsolete range-finding equipment, had proven woefully inadequate. During the lull, Spanish boats darted among their burning ships, rescuing wounded and attempting to save what vessels they could. The Reina Cristina was clearly doomed. Her fires were beyond control, and she was settling by the stern. Admiral Montoyo, his flagship destroyed beneath him, transferred his flag to the smaller Isla de Cuba, determined to continue the fight with whatever remained of his squadron. The ancient Castilla presented a pitiful sight. The wooden-hulled vessel was completely ablaze, her crew having abandoned ship to prevent further casualties. She would continue burning for hours. A funeral pyre for Spanish naval ambitions in the Pacific, Captain Gridley used the break to assess his ammunition reserves, and was relieved to find them more than adequate for completing the morning's work. The gun crews, many of whom had never fired in anger before, had performed magnificently. Their rate of fire and accuracy had exceeded even Dewey's optimistic expectations. At 10:40, the Commodore gave the order to resume action. The American line formed again, steaming slowly past the Spanish positions with guns trained on their targets. This time, however, there would be no measured response from the enemy. The Spanish squadron had been reduced to a handful of barely floating hulks, their fighting capacity all but eliminated. The Don Antonio de Ulloa made one final heroic gesture. Captain Cadarso, though mortally wounded, ordered his remaining gun to fire one last defiant shot at the approaching Americans. It would be his ship's final act. Minutes later, a salvo from the USS Petrel sent the gallant vessel to the bottom of Manila Bay, taking her brave captain with her. The battle was effectively over. Though the destruction would continue for another hour, as American guns methodically finished off the remaining Spanish vessels, in just over 4 hours, Dewey had achieved what many considered impossible: the complete destruction of an enemy fleet without the loss of a single American life. By 11:30 that morning, silence had returned to Manila Batha. Terrible silence that follows battle, broken only by the crackle of flames and the cries of men in the water. Where the Spanish squadron had anchored at dawn, only smoke, debris, and oil slicks remained. The Battle of Manila Bay was over, and with it, Spain's 300-year dominion over the Philippines. Admiral Patricio Montoyo, his flag now flying, from the barely floating Isla de Cuba, surveyed the destruction with the stoicism of a professional soldier. Of his 7 vessels, only 2 remained capable of any action, and those barely. The Reina Cristina lay on the bottom, her masts protruding from the shallow water like the fingers of a drowning giant. The Don Antonio de Ulloa had followed her to the bottom, carrying the gallant Captain Cadarso to his sailor's grave. The Castilla continued to burn, her wooden hull providing fuel for flames that would smolder for days. Commodore Dewey, standing on the Olympia's bridge, felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. In a few hours he had accomplished more than just a military victory. He had announced America's emergence as a Pacific power. The implications staggered him. These islands, with their millions of inhabitants and strategic position, would now presumably fall under American control. The responsibility was enormous. The human cost, remarkably. Told a story of technological disparity rather than human failure. Spanish casualties numbered in the hundreds. Exact figures would never be determined, as many bodies went down with their ships. Among the dead were some of Spain's most gallant naval officers, men who had died at their posts rather than surrender their vessels. Captain Cadarso's sacrifice would be remembered in Spanish naval circles for generations. American casualties were almost non-existent. 8 men wounded, none killed, a statistic so favorable it seemed almost incredible. The USS Olympia bore a few shell scars, and the Baltimore showed minor damage from her single hit, but the squadron remained entirely combat effective. The disparity spoke volumes about the revolution in naval technology and training that had occurred in the previous 2 decades. A detailed analysis published in the London Times Naval Correspondence Dispatch noted that the battle represented the most complete naval victory since Trafalgar, achieved with the most minimal friendly casualties in modern naval history, but victory brought immediate complications. The Spanish garrison in Manila still controlled the city and its formidable fortifications. Governor-General Basilio Agustin Davila had thousands of troops at his disposal and seemed determined to continue resistance. Moreover, Filipino revolutionaries under Emilio Aguinaldo were already active throughout the islands, fighting their own war of independence against Spanish rule. Dewey found himself in the peculiar position of having destroyed Spanish naval power. Without having sufficient forces to occupy the territory he had conquered, his squadron could control the bay and bombard shore positions, but he lacked the troops necessary for major land operations. The Commodore immediately dispatched the revenue cutter McCulloch to Hong Kong with news of his victory and urgent requests for reinforcements. The destruction of the Spanish fleet had taken just over 4 hours, but the consequences would reshape the Pacific for decades to come. Spanish colonial administrators throughout the region now faced the reality that their homeland could no longer project naval power to protect its distant possessions. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction of Montoya's ships in Madrid. The news would arrive like a thunderbolt. The Spanish government had expected their Pacific squadron to conduct a fighting withdrawal, perhaps inflicting significant casualties on the Americans before eventually succumbing. Instead, they received reports of total annihilation without reciprocal damage. The disaster would contribute to the Spanish government's decision to seek peace negotiations, though fighting would continue for several more months in both the Caribbean and Pacific theaters. For the United States, May 1st, 1898, marked a crucial turning point. The nation that had spent its first century focused on continental expansion suddenly found itself in possession of overseas territories requiring permanent naval protection. The victory at Manila Bay would necessitate the construction of a modern battle fleet capable of operating across the Pacific, a commitment that would define American naval policy for the next half-century. As the tropical sun reached its zenith, Commodore Dewey began the complex task of consolidating his victory while planning for the challenges ahead. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Manila Bay as Commodore Dewey surveyed the wreckage of what had been the Spanish Pacific Fleet. From the Olympia's bridge, he could see Filipino insurgents already gathering along the shoreline, their small boats darting between the smoking hulks to rescue Spanish sailors from the water. The sight troubled him. These revolutionaries, led by the exiled Emilio Aguinaldo, represented another complication in an already complex situation. Captain Final count shows 381 Spanish killed or missing, with approximately 200 wounded. Our own casualties remain at 8 wounded, none fatal. Gridley's voice carried a note of amazement that such a complete victory had been achieved at so small a cost. Dewey nodded grimly. The numbers, while militarily satisfying, represented hundreds of Spanish families who would receive devastating news in the coming weeks. Many of the dead were young officers and sailors who had served with distinction in a hopeless cause. Captain Luis Cadarso, in particular, had earned Dewey's grudging respect for his final defiant gesture aboard the sinking Don Antonio de Ulloa. The immediate tactical situation demanded attention. The Spanish shore batteries at Cavite had remained largely silent during the battle, their commanders apparently unwilling to draw American fire onto the naval yard facilities. Now, with the fleet destroyed, these guns represented the only significant Spanish military presence in the immediate area. Dewey ordered the USS Petrel and USS Raleigh to close with the arsenal and demand its surrender. At 2:15 in the afternoon, a white flag appeared over the Cavite Naval Station, Rear Admiral Montoya having transferred once again this time. Shore formally surrendered the facility and its contents to avoid further bloodshed. The capture yielded significant prizes: modern shore guns, ammunition stores, and several smaller vessels that had taken refuge in the inner harbor, according to the official report filed with the Navy Department and subsequently published in the Army and Navy Journal. The Cavite Naval Station contained extensive dry dock facilities, modern machinery, and sufficient coal stores to supply the squadron for several months of operations. The political implications of the victory were already becoming apparent. Spanish civil authority in Manila remained intact, but Governor-General Agustin de Villa was effectively isolated. His forces could control the city itself, but American naval guns now commanded the approaches to the capital. More troubling for the Spanish authorities, Filipino insurgents were beginning to emerge from hiding throughout the archipelago. Sensing that Spanish power was cracking, Emilio Aguinaldo, the revolutionary leader, had been in exile in Hong Kong. When the battle occurred, sensing opportunity, he was making arrangements to return to the Philippines aboard American vessels. Dewey, lacking specific instructions regarding the Filipino independence movement, found himself in the awkward position of cooperating with rebels against Spanish authority, while simultaneously preparing to assume American control over the same territory. The broader strategic picture was equally complex. Spain's Pacific possessions, the Philippines, Guam, the Caroline Islands were now effectively cut off from the mother country. Without naval protection, these territories could not be reinforced or supplied from Spain. The psychological effect on Spanish colonial administrators throughout the region was devastating, intelligence reports reaching Dewey suggested that Spanish morale in Manila was collapsing. Officers who had expected to conduct a lengthy defense were now questioning whether resistance served any purpose. The garrison, composed largely of Filipino troops with Spanish officers, showed signs of increasing unreliability as news of the naval disaster spread through the city. The Commodore faced an immediate practical problem. His squadron needed supplies and maintenance after the battle, but Hong Kong, the nearest major port with adequate facilities, was British territory. Great Britain had declared neutrality in the Spanish-American War, which theoretically prohibited belligerent vessels from using British ports for military purposes. Dewey would need to negotiate carefully to maintain his operational capability. More fundamentally, the United States government had not yet decided what to do with the Philippines if Spain were defeated. The McKinley administration had focused primarily on Cuban independence, with the Pacific Campaign serving mainly to pressure Spain into negotiations. Now, faced with the reality of controlling strategically vital territory inhabited by millions of people, Washington would need to formulate entirely new policies for overseas empire. As evening approached on that historic May 1st, Dewey found himself master of Manila Bay, but facing challenges that would test American resolve for decades to come. The easy part, destroying the Spanish fleet, was over. The hard part, determining what American victory actually meant, was just beginning. Night fell over Manila Bay with the peculiar swiftness of the tropics. But sleep eluded Commodore Dewey as he contemplated the magnitude of what had transpired. From his cabin aboard the Olympia, he could see the glow of fires still burning among the Spanish wrecks, their flickering light reflecting off the calm waters like fallen stars. The battle was over, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold across Demispers, in Washington. The news of Dewey's victory would not arrive for several days due to the primitive state of trans-Pacific communications. The Commodore had dispatched the revenue cutter McCulloch to Hong Kong with his initial reports. but the ship would not reach port until May 3rd. From there, his messages would travel by commercial cable to London, then across the Atlantic, to New York, and finally to the capital. The delay meant that President William McKinley and his cabinet remained unaware that American arms had achieved one of the most complete naval victories in modern history. The Spanish government in Madrid faced a similar communications lag. But fragmentary reports were already reaching European capitals through various channels. The news would devastate Spanish morale and contribute to the political crisis that would eventually topple the conservative government of Praxis Mateo Sagasta. More immediately, it would force a fundamental reassessment of Spanish strategy. In both the Pacific and Caribbean theaters, Admiral Montoyo, now a prisoner in all but name, spent the evening composing his official report to Madrid. The document, a model of professional honesty, detailed the hopeless position his squadron had faced from the outset. His ships had been undermanned, poorly maintained, and equipped with defective ammunition. Several vessels, including the Castilla, had been in such poor condition that they could barely maintain steam pressure. Against Dewey's modern squadron, manned by well-trained crews and equipped with the latest ordnance, defeat had been inevitable. The Filipino population of Manila watched these developments with intense interest. For 3 centuries, Spanish rule had seemed permanent and unchangeable. Now, in a single morning, that assumption had been shattered. Revolutionary activity, suppressed but never eliminated, began to resurface throughout the archipelago. Emilio Aguinaldo, monitoring events from Hong Kong, prepared to return and resume his struggle for Philippine independence. Contemporary accounts from the Manila correspondent of the Singapore Straits Times described the city as electric with anticipation and uncertainty. As residents attempted to comprehend the magnitude of the morning's events and their implications for the future, European reaction to Dewey's victory varied by nation and interest. Great Britain, the dominant naval power, watched American success with mixed feelings. While pleased to see Spanish influence diminished in the Pacific, British naval strategists recognized that the United States had announced its arrival as a serious rival for maritime supremacy. Germany, which had its own imperial ambitions in the Pacific, began considering how to respond to this new American presence in what had been considered European waters. Captain Charles Gridley, despite his satisfaction with his ship's performance, found himself troubled by the battle's implications. A career naval officer, he understood better than most civilians the enormous commitment required to maintain effective control over distant overseas territories. The Philippines alone contained over 7 million inhabitants spread across thousands of islands. Governing such a diverse population would require resources, administrative skill, and military commitment far beyond anything the United States had previously attempted. The tactical lessons of the battle were already being analyzed by naval officers throughout the world. Engagement had demonstrated the decisive advantages of modern gunnery, superior training, and technological superiority. Spanish courage had proven insufficient to overcome fundamental disadvantages in equipment and preparation. Naval academies from Annapolis to Greenwich would study Dewey's victory for decades, drawing lessons about fleet tactics, gunnery techniques, and the importance of maintaining technological superiority. More broadly, the Battle of Manila Bay marked a crucial turning point in the global balance of power. Spain's maritime empire, which had once dominated both the Atlantic and Pacific, was clearly entering its final phase. The United States, previously focused on continental expansion, had demonstrated its capacity to project naval power across the world's largest ocean. The age of American isolationism was ending, though few Americans yet grasped the full implications of their new status. As Dewey finally retired to his cabin in the early hours of May 2nd, he carried the weight of these responsibilities. Squadron controlled Manila Bay, but that was merely the beginning. The real challenge is establishing American authority, dealing with Filipino aspirations for independence, and maintaining control over a vast archipelago lay ahead. The victory that had made him a national hero had also made him an imperial proconsul, responsible for decisions that would affect millions of lives and shape American foreign policy for generations to come. 6 months after the guns fell silent, in Manila Bay, Commodore George Dewey found himself transformed from a relatively obscure naval officer into the most famous American of his generation. Congress had promoted him to Admiral the First in the U.S. Navy's history, and his name graced everything, from cigars to baby carriages. Yet as he walked the deck of his flagship on a humid November evening, Dewey understood that his victory had unleashed forces far beyond his ability to control. The Philippines had fallen to American forces after a brief but decisive campaign. General Wesley Merritt's the 8th Corps, hastily assembled and transported across the Pacific, had occupied Manila in August following a carefully choreographed battle that allowed Spanish forces to surrender with honor while keeping Filipino insurgents from entering the city. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December, would formally transfer the islands to American sovereignty for the sum of $20 million, but peace with Spain had not brought peace to the Philippines. Emilio Aguinaldo's revolutionary government, which had initially welcomed American intervention as liberation from Spanish rule, now viewed the United States as simply another colonial power. Tensions were rising throughout the archipelago as it became clear that American intentions involved permanent occupation rather than immediate independence. The seeds of what would become the Philippine-American War were already germinating. Admiral Dewey, now serving as president of the American Commission governing the islands, found himself grappling with problems far more complex than naval combat. The Philippines contained dozens of distinct ethnic groups speaking more than 80 different languages. Some regions had embraced Christianity under Spanish rule, while others remained animist or Muslim. Creating a unified administration for such diversity challenged every assumption about American governance. A comprehensive analysis published in The Atlantic Monthly observed that the victory which seemed so complete on May 1st has revealed itself as merely the first chapter in a far more complex story of imperial responsibility and ethnic conflict. The international consequences of Manila Bay continued to reverberate. Germany, frustrated in its own Pacific ambitions, had dispatched a naval squadron to Philippine waters during the summer, ostensibly to protect German commercial interests. The resulting tensions between American and German forces had nearly precipitated a second crisis, resolved only through British diplomatic intervention. The incident demonstrated how Dewey's victory had drawn the United States into the complex web of great power rivalries that dominated global politics. In Washington, the McKinley administration struggled to develop coherent policies for governing overseas territories inhabited by non-white populations. The Constitution made no provision for colonial administration, and fierce debates raged over whether the document's guarantees applied to new territories. Anti-imperialists, led by figures like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie, argued that empire contradicted fundamental American principles. Imperialists countered that national greatness required overseas expansion and that the United States had a duty to civilize backward populations. The U.S. Navy had been transformed by the victory's demands. Congress, recognizing that overseas empire required naval supremacy, authorized construction of new battleships and cruisers. The Great White Fleet that would later circumnavigate the globe was a direct consequence of the responsibilities Dewey had assumed on that May morning. American naval strategy shifted from coastal defense to power projection, change that would define military policy well into the 20th century. Captain Charles Gridley, sadly, had not lived to see these developments. The stress of the campaign and subsequent occupation duties had broken his health, and he had died of fever in June while serving as Dewey's chief of staff in Manila. His death symbolized the hidden costs of empire, just the dramatic casualties of battle. But the slow attrition of men worn down by tropical disease and administrative burdens for the Spanish officers who had fought so gallantly that May morning, the aftermath brought mixed fortunes. Admiral Montoyo faced court-martial in Madrid for the loss of his squadron, though the proceedings ultimately recognized that he had fought with honor under impossible circumstances. Many of his surviving officers would rebuild their careers in Spain's reduced fleet, while others emigrated to the Americas to start new lives far from the scenes of their defeat. The Battle of Manila Bay had lasted only 7 hours, but its consequences shaped the next century of American foreign policy. The victory demonstrated American sales, military capability, while simultaneously committing the nation to defend territories thousands of miles from home. It marked the end of Spanish colonial empire in the Pacific, while establishing the United States as a global power with all the responsibilities that status entailed. As Admiral Dewey prepared for his eventual return to the United States in 1900, he reflected on how completely his life had changed since that distant May morning. He had achieved the complete victory that every naval officer dreamed of, but success had proven more complex than defeat might have been. The easy part, sinking ships, was over. The hard part, building an empire, would occupy American policymakers. For decades to come, the echo of those guns in Manila Bay would resound through American history, marking the moment when the United States stepped onto the world stage as an imperial power. With all the glory and burden that role demanded,